I just spend more time on one aspect of the story than I meant to. I know last week we spent a lot of time talking about Absalom's revolt and his attempt to overthrow King David, his own father. And I just find that an exciting story. That's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. I think it's the most exciting part of the historical books. I really enjoy that story. And it's one of those things where even though you've read it 100 times, you know how it's going to end up. It's still just suspenseful because the hour is desperate for David. He ends up, of course, keeping his kingdom, and Absalom is killed. And the revolt is suppressed, and David returns to the throne. But he's never really, in a sense, I guess you could say, as you read through the book of 2 Samuel and finish up David's life, he's never really happy after the sin with Bathsheba, which may have been an indirect cause of what took place with Absalom's revolt. Because if you remember the story, David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister, and then Absalom, he gets angry about that. So since David didn't do anything about it, Absalom did something about it. And of course, then that leads, I think he probably perceived that David was weak. So he was a very shrewd and very wicked individual, and he tries to take over the kingdom. Of course, he does not succeed because Hushai, one of David's counselors, goes back and he thwarts the counsel of Ahithophel, as we read. And we talked about all this last week, so there's no reason to go over all that ground again. But David is never really the same. He's getting older, obviously. He's a little bit slower on the draw. And he shows himself to be something perhaps, and again, this is sort of conjecture, just reading between the lines. He just shows himself to be ineffectual in terms of handling his household. Particularly his adult children, now that he is an old man here. Anyway, we find here that the civil war took place, ends in chapter 20, verse 26. And he had all these family problems leading up to it. And then we see some settling of some old scores. And if you want to look at that very quickly, what takes place here is that this is not recorded, by the way, anywhere in Scripture other than here. So they're looking back on something that is not recorded prior to this. But the Gibeonites say, you know, the house of Saul, they harmed us. They did wickedness to us. We want some vengeance. So David says, what do you want me to do? And he said, and they say in return, verse 6, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth. You know the story of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is the one who was Jonathan's son, who was crippled in his feet because during the battle when the Philistines defeated Saul and Jonathan, his nurse was running with him, and apparently she dropped him and somehow broke his back, and he was lame in his feet. So anyway, to show mercy and kindness to Jonathan's family, David shows mercy to Mephibosheth and makes him part of his family. So they spare him. And at any rate, then we find out as you go on through this that some other Philistines in the line of Goliath, who of course David took care of back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you start reading in about verse, 15. Now here's where you can start to see that David is getting old and he's losing his abilities. Now when the Philistines were at war again with Israel, David, this is verse 15, chapter 21, verse 15 of 2 Samuel. David went down and his servants with him, and as they fought against the Philistines, David became weary. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giant, that is Goliath, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. Now, when David was a younger man, he'd have put the wood to this guy, right? I mean, he killed Goliath with a sling. If David were a younger man, he would have probably been able to defeat this person without much ado. Kern, I'm reading between the lines a little bit, but you remember the story from 1 Samuel 17 when he was just probably 16 years old. He has no problem taking care of Goliath. But anyway, he's going to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then a men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall not go out again with us to battle." so that you do not extinguish the lamp of Israel. So David here clearly is not the warrior that he used to be. Now it came about after this that there was war again with the Philistines. These Philistines have been a thorn in Israel's side ever since the days of the judges. The Philistines probably were descendants of people from Greece. They were, I'm not an expert in this, but apparently that is the consensus, that they came from the Greek Isles and settled here. And that's where we get the word Palestine, comes from Philistines. All right, Philistine, Palestine. And anyway, they were probably descendants of, or had come from Greece. They were Greek people. But anyway, they're constantly fighting against Israel here. There was war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, that's kind of interesting. We got another Goliath here. And he sounds a lot like the first one. And Elhanan, the son of killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. There was a war at Gath again, where there was a man of great stature, had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also had been born to the giant. When he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath. So it's interesting that individual there must have been, in verse 19, the son of Goliath. Let's see, killed Goliath the Gittite. Okay, instead of Goliath of Gath, it's Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So he must have been a son of Goliath as well. So these 4 individuals were all descendants of Goliath, and they fell by David and by the hand of his servants. Now we have this song by David here, starting in verse 22, without going into all of the details here. But if you look at this psalm, or this song, it's very much like what you'll find in the book of Psalms. And David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now that happened a long time before, right? And he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge. That's Psalm 18, verses 1 and 2 right there. So this passage here is merely not a restatement of, or I guess it could be considered a restatement of Psalm 18. And if you read through this and compare it with Psalm 18, you'll find that they're very, very similar. David's mighty men in chapter 23, without going into all the details again, it's just a kind of a rundown of who David's choice soldiers were, the ones that were his commanders, the ones that were considered the most valiant in battle. And then finally, David's sin in numbering the people. Now, again, this shows that David is, I don't want to say he's senile, but he's just not thinking clearly. Because I can't, in a sense, imagine David doing this when he was a younger man. And I'm not trying to in any way discredit older men. I'm getting older all the time, but I realize I'm not as quick on my feet as I used to be. I'm not physically perhaps as strong as I used to be. I don't think clearly as I used to sometimes. I'm getting to that point every once in a while where I'll do something that I've done 10,000 times and I'll start to do it. And oh, wait a minute. How do you do that? Or which way do I go when I come to this crossroad? I've gone this direction 50,000 times and I've followed this trail 50,000 times, but all of a sudden I'm turned around and I have to think for a second. So it happens to all of us. And I think that's what's happening to David here. But notice here, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. Now, this is a cardinal sin. God told them not to number the people. And they occasionally were ordered to take a census, but they weren't just to go out willy-nilly and take a census whenever they felt like it. And I think the reason behind that is because God didn't want them to put trust in how many men they could amass for an army. And like I said, there are places where you can go back to the book of Exodus, for example, the book of Numbers, and the tribes, they take censuses or censes, whatever the plural is for census. And they take those and then they figure out how many individuals are in each tribe. And they figure out how many men are able to go to war from the age of 20 up to 50 or whatever the case might have been. But David here just kind of willy-nilly says, I'm going to go ahead and number everybody. Now, Joab, who so far has shown himself to be shrewd, both in a good and in a bad sense, and he's been a murderer. He's murdered 2 or 3 different people. He murdered Abner, for example. He's murdered other people that he saw threats to his power. But here, Joab shows common sense. And he says, the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, go about through all the tribe of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register. That'd be like saying from, go from the shores of California to the East Coast, right? I mean, cover the entire country. Register the people that I may know the number of my people. But Joab said to the king, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my Lord the king still see. But why does my Lord the king delight in this thing? Don't do this. You shouldn't be doing this. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the commanders of the army. So evidently the army's against this as well. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to register the people of Israel. So they do this, and if you go down to verse 10, he gets the report. He finds out that there are 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, according to verse 9. But look at verse 10. As soon as this happens, now David's heart troubled him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly. When David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, go and speak to David. Thus says the Lord, I am offering you 3 things. Choose the one you want. So Gad comes to David and he says, all right, you have 7 years of famine, or you can flee 3 months before your enemies, or there'll be 3 days of pestilence in the land. Take your pick. David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of men. So this pestilence begins. Let me think. David really shines now again. Again, he shows himself to be what he used to be. Here he's made these foolish mistakes. He's slow on the draw. He's not the warrior that he used to be. He seems to be thinking more slowly than he used to. But now that this takes place and the pestilence begins, David decides he wants to put an end to this pestilence. The destroyer begins going through the nation and killing people. So Gad came to David and that day and said to him, go up, erect an altar. This is verse 18. Erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David went up according to the word of Gad, just as the Lord had commanded. Araunah looked down and saw the king and his servants crossing over towards him. Then Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, to buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be held back from the people. Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up what is good in his sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for wood. Everything, O king, Araunah gives to the king. You can take it. You can have it for nothing. And may the Lord accept you. However, the Lord said to Araunah, note this. This is something to remember. This, again, David shines here. No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price. For I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. I was always impressed by that. David said, I'm not taking the easy way out. This is going to cost me. That's what a sacrifice is. A sacrifice is something that costs. So when David comes to him, he says, I'm not going to let you take the responsibility. I'm going to buy it so that I lose out in this deal, in a sense, because that's what the sacrifice does. And that's why when the scriptures tell us, for example, in the book of Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, you are to be a living sacrifice. In other words, your entire life is to be a sacrifice, a loss for Jesus Christ. You take up your cross and you follow him. And as I mentioned many times, we often think that my cross is I've got bad eyesight, or my cross is I've got a pinched sciatica, or my cross is I've got some sickness or I've got some problem in my family. That's not what a cross is. When Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me, he's saying, die to yourself, because the cross is an instrument of death. So when a person would take up their cross and they would make them carry their cross through town, remember how Jesus had to carry his cross when he was crucified. The reason they made them do that, it was a sign to other people that this is what happens, first of all, when you go against the Roman government. But it was also, people could look at that and see that that person was taking their cross out of the city. They knew that person wasn't coming back, not alive. So when Jesus says, take up your cross, he's saying, die to yourself. You must love me above everything else. Everything that you do has to be out of worship for me, out of deference to me, out of humility and service to me, not for yourself. And that's why he says you have to hate your mother, your father, your children, your loved ones, your lands for my sake. Anyone who loves his life will lose it. He who hates his life in this world will keep it unto life eternal. Everything is done in sacrifice to him. So David here says, I'm not going to sacrifice in a way that costs me nothing. I'm giving my all in order to stay this plague. David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Thus the Lord was moved by prayer for the land, and the plague was held back from Israel. And that's how the book ends, with David on a high note. After several failures, after several chapters of David making mistake after mistake after mistake, and seeing his life become desperate and filled with pain and sorrow, some of it of his own making, perhaps all of it of his own making, either directly or indirectly, at the end of the book, he once again shows himself to be a man after God's own heart. So I've always enjoyed that one verse. If you could, nothing else I say today, take that verse with you. Any questions or comments over anything, please throw in anything you'd like to add, anything you've noticed perhaps as we've been going through this. I know this is an overview. It's not meant to be detailed. We stop every once in a while for what I think are important details, but what of it? Anything that you think of, see, would like to point out, any high notes? Well, if not, we'll go on and just take a look at the rest of the notes here. Key chapters, chapter 7, the Davidic covenant. Key verses are, again, within that chapter regarding the Davidic covenant, that you will have a descendant sit upon your throne forever. The key people are David, Nathan, Bathsheba, Joab, Abner, and Absalom. They're the ones who are either major, or they're either the lead characters or they're the second leads. Themes that are developed in the New Testament, clearly the Davidic covenant. Matthew chapter 1 and 2, Luke chapter 1, verses 30 to 33. And also in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, the idea of the Davidic covenant is mentioned there as well, which would have come several hundred years after the events that we've just recorded here or discussed here. What's the message? Rags to riches. David comes from nothing, becomes king of Israel. God's protective care. Even in the midst of all of his failures and foibles, God still kept his covenant with David and protected him through all of his hardship. God's all-seeing eye. Always remember that, friends. And again, this is not meant to be a threat. This is something that I think of often myself, is before you sin, remember that you're not getting away with anything. It's like David, when he gets caught, he recognizes on how he didn't figure this out beforehand, but he does all these things thinking he's going to get away with it. Remember that one verse? But the thing that David had done was displeasing to the Lord. The Lord knew it all along. So he sends the prophet to go and confront him. And oftentimes, we're doing something, thinking something, behaving in such a way that is displeasing to the Lord. We think, nobody's going to know about this. Sure they are. For there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Accordingly, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light. What you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. You can mark it down, that it's all going to come out. It's already all known. So it's something we need to keep in mind. It's a good deterrent for sin, and it's a good motivation for holiness. And we should always want to be holy for the right reasons. I want to please the Lord. You know, we should always say, I want to do what is good. I want to be able to practice Christian virtue because it's pleasing to the Lord. But by the same token, the flip side is I don't want to do evil because I know that it's bad, and I know I'm going to get caught, and I know I won't get away with it. The Davidic covenant obviously is a big part of this message. Worship and praise. There's a lot of that here, particularly, like I said, David's songs at the end of the book. David's faults, which were several. David was something of a Renaissance man. I think I already mentioned this when we started 1 Samuel. But he was also a man of great passions, whether it was sexual passion, whether it was anger. He had a terrible temper, it appears. He was one that, could go into incredible mourning. And then from there, he could go to incredible anger and vindictiveness. And of course, we look at his life. Everything that is written was written for our instruction, right? We can look back at David's life and say, I'm not going to be like that. I'm going to be like that. That's a good example. That's a bad example. So David's faults are instructive to us, as well as are his praiseworthy actions and attitudes. God's grace. God's grace is seen in David's life all throughout the book of 2 Samuel. Even though he committed the sin with Bathsheba and he killed Uriah the Hittite and he deserved to die, God said, no, you will not die. His grace came into play there. Of course, the ramifications were far-reaching and awful. And David, like I said, was never, you just don't see him happy and content after that Bathsheba incident. If you go back and read the first part of the book, he's carrying out wars and so forth. But by the same token, when he's always seemingly jubilant, triumphant, worshipful, thankful, and then after that, things take a nosedive in his life. I'm not saying he never had any happy moments again. I'm not saying that at all. It's just that from what's recorded, you can see there's a big change, a big shift after chapter 11. Application. Even kings need the Lord. All right. No matter how much power, no matter how much authority, no matter how much wealth someone has, they always need the Lord. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. That's another thing that we can carry forth as an application in this book. Positions of power are not to be used for personal gain. Again, David and Bathsheba. No one is above the law. No one can escape God's all-seeing eye. Take care to teach your children about God. Amnon and Absalom both were great failures. And again, who knows what David's relationship was with them when they were little. It's hard to know because that's not recorded for us. But the scriptures do teach us that, raise a child in the way that he will go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. That's a general rule of thumb. But it makes you wonder, as if you're the king and you've got 8 or 9 wives and you've got all these responsibilities and you're constantly out to war and other people are raising your children for you, how much time did he really spend with his children, teaching them about the things of God? I don't know. I'm not judging him, but I'm making application for us because it is so easy for us to become bogged down with the things of life, whether it's work or home responsibilities, whatever the case might be, education. Sometimes, people are adults and they're going to school and their kids can be kind of left behind. Make sure that you're spending that time with your kids and teaching them about the Lord. All right. Deal with sin not only in your life, but in the lives of your children and subordinates. That was another one of David's faults. When a sin arose in his family, he didn't do anything about it. He just let it ride. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Of course, that's not in the Bible, but that principle certainly is in the Bible from time to time. And David, when kings were supposed to be out to war, instead of being out to war, he was looking out his window. We're accountable to one another. Nathan came to David, and David was accountable to the word of the prophet Nathan. Actions bring consequences. We see that all throughout the book of 2 Samuel. And when we sin, we fall on the unending mercy and grace of God, as did David. On more than one occasion, by the way. Again, anybody have any questions or comments over anything in 2 Samuel? Great book, good stuff. All right, well, let's go ahead and go on to 1 Kings. David is still alive at this time. And we begin this book. It's the 8th foundational book. The foundational books are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges. Wait a minute. I messed up. 8th foundational book? Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges. Yeah, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and then 1 Kings. It's the 8th foundational book. It begins with the final days of King David and ends with King Ahaziah in the north, the son of Ahab, and Jehoshaphat, the king of the south, son of Asa, around 125 years later. So about 125 years pass in the book of 1 Kings. The key to the book is chapter 12, when the northern 10 tribes of Israel rebel against Judah and Benjamin and form a separate kingdom called Israel, or Samaria, or the northern kingdom, as opposed to Judah. So sometimes when you see the word Israel in the Old Testament, it doesn't mean all 12 tribes. It means the 10 northern tribes, the ones who broke away in chapter 12. And we'll get to that. That's a key chapter. It's an important event in the history of the nation of Israel. The northern kingdom never had a godly king, whereas Judah had a number of them. If you can look at, in a sense, the northern kingdom's history on one of those graphs, theirs goes like this, whereas Judah's goes like this. They're both inconsistent in the sense that some are better than others, but for all practical purposes, it was a downward spin for the northern kingdom. The closest they had to a godly king would have been Jehu, but even he was not really what you'd consider a godly man. He carried out what God wanted him to do by wiping out the Ahab's family, but he really wasn't a Hezekiah. He wasn't a Josiah or an Asa, somebody like that at all. So they had nothing but wicked kings. Not only that, there were several dynasties within the northern kingdom. Every once in a while, a king would get assassinated, and then somebody else would come in, a completely different family. So I get killed, my kids get wiped out, somebody else becomes king, a few of his kids become king, somebody comes in, kills him, completely different family. So there's several different dynasties throughout the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, there was only one dynasty, and it was David's, because God promised that he would always have someone to sit upon the throne of Israel. A woman later on by the name of Athaliah, which actually is, I believe, in, let's see, is it 2 Kings? Athaliah almost puts an end to David's line by threatening in the days of Joash, who was just a very small child. But she does not succeed. God maintains his promise to David by protecting Joash. But anyway, Northern Kingdom never had a godly king. Judah had a number of them. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles can be difficult to follow because so many different kings are mentioned with alternating treatment between northern kings and southern ones. Also, many kings had the same or similar names. And sometimes their names are changed. For example, Joash might be called Joash here, but Jehoash over here. So are we talking about the same person? Well, yeah. But it's hard to follow. And that's why I think sometimes we read these kinds of books and we go through 1st, 2nd Kings, we go through 1st, 2nd Chronicles, and we quickly become lost because we're not familiar with the Old Testament history. And I'm not an expert in this myself. I know enough to get around in the Old Testament, obviously, and in these books. But in terms of like being a real Old Testament, I've got all these things memorized and I know who's who. And, I get confused myself sometimes. So don't let that bother you. But it's still, there's some good stuff to read here. You get into 1st Kings and you start reading about Elijah and the Baal worshipers. There's a lot of good stuff, a lot of fun stuff to read. Anyway, outline. The maintenance of the United Kingdom. We see that in chapter 1, verse 1 through 11:43. And we start out, Solomon is installed as king in chapter 1 and chapter 2 through about verse 11. Now, in this text, again, without going into all of this, you find that there is a young man by the name of Adonijah. There is some confusion regarding who's going to be David's successor. And anyway, if you look at this, Adonijah, verse 5, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him. His father had never crossed him at any time by asking, why have you done so? And he was also a very handsome man, and he was born after Absalom. Now, in other words, then, Adonijah apparently has been making these kinds of overtures, I'm going to be king, but David never says anything to him. Again, David does not stop him. Maybe David didn't know who was supposed to be king following him, and he just kind of lets this thing ride. But Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Rei, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah, though some were, in verse 7. Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen, and fatlings by the stone of Zoheleth, which is besides En-Rogel, and he invited all of his brothers, the king's sons, and so on and so forth. Well, Nathan and Bathsheba go to David and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on? Who's supposed to be king? Isn't Absalom supposed to be king? David has not made a definitive answer so far to that question. So he says, yep, Solomon is to be king. Okay, now what do you think is going to go through Adonijah's mind once he hears that the king has declared that Solomon is to be king? Well, he immediately then would be seen as, what do you think? He'd be in jeopardy. In a sense, no fault of his own, but he now has to tread lightly, because if he's made overtures to being king, who knows how he can be trusted in the future now that Solomon has been named king. So Adonijah needs to tread lightly. And actually, they do let him slide. So anyway, Adonijah finds out Solomon is anointed as king. And then we find, starting in verse 5 of chapter 2 here, David's charge regarding his enemies here. Now you also know that Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me. And we're going to get back to Adonijah in just a little bit. Look what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, the son of Ner, and to Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed. He also shed the blood of war in peace, and he put the blood of war on his belt about his waist and on his handles and on his feet. In other words, this guy was like a General Patton. He loved war. He loved the violence. He loved the killing, apparently. And he was a murderer. People would come to him in peace and extend the hand of peace, and he would kill them. He did that with Abner and also Amasa. So act according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to Sheol in peace, Sheol being the place of the grave. But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. for they assisted me when I fled from Absalom your brother. Behold, here is with you Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjamite of Bahurim. Now it was he who cursed me with a violent curse on the day I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now, therefore, do not let him go unpunished. If you are a wise man, and you will know what you ought to do with him, and you will bring his gray hair down to Sheol with blood. So he's telling Solomon, here's what you need to do with these enemies of mine. So he leaves that to Solomon to handle, because he's on his last legs, as it were. David is about to die. So David slept with his fathers in verse 10. The days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years, and Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and she said, do you come peacefully? And he said, peacefully. Then he said, I have something to say to you. And she said, speak. So he said, you know that the kingdom was mine and that all Israel expected me to be king. However, the kingdom was turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. Now I am making one request of you. Do not refuse me. And she said to him, speak. Then he said, please speak to Solomon the king, for he will not refuse you, that he may give me Abishag the Shunammite as a wife. Now remember, we didn't read this, but in the very beginning of this book, 1 Kings, Abishag was a nurse. And let's go back and take a look at that. We probably shouldn't have overlooked that because it is important. Now, King David was old, advanced in age, and they covered him with clothes, but he could not keep warm. So he's 70 years old now, as we just read. He reigned for, he died when he was 70 years old. So his servant said to him, let them seek a young virgin for my lord the king, and let her attend the king and become his nurse, and let her lie in your bosom, that my lord may keep warm. So they searched for a beautiful girl throughout all the territory of Israel, and they found Abishag the Shunammite and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful, and she became the king's nurse and served him, but the king did not cohabit with her. So anyway, she's just there, to put it bluntly. He's lying in bed, he can't get warm, so she just snuggles up to him and keeps him warm. And that's her function as his nurse. Well, now Adonijah comes and he says, hey, Bathsheba, I got a request. Well, what is it? I want Abishag the Shunammite to be my wife. What's the problem here? What's the big deal? Let's read on and we'll see what happens. So Bathsheba, verse 19 of chapter 2. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah. Hey, Adonijah, is it okay if Solomon, is it okay if Adonijah has Abishag? King Solomon said, no. And anyway, Solomon, let me see here. Now, where to go? Okay. I tried to get ahead of myself here a little bit. I lost my place. So she said, look at verse 21. So she said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah, your brother, as a wife. King Solomon answered and said to his mother, and why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him also the kingdom, for he is my older brother, even for him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. In other words, Abiathar and Joab want this Adonijah to be king. Why is Solomon so upset just because he wants this woman as his wife? Remember, what's that? Well, she has access to the king, but remember when Absalom came in and ran David out of town, what was the first thing he did? He went in to David's concubines and cohabited with them. Why did he do that? Well, I think that's part of it, certainly. But that was when anybody here ever see the movie? And again, I don't want to speak too authoritatively on this, but anybody ever see the movie Braveheart? Okay, in the movie Braveheart, King Longshanks is dying. And anyway, as he's on his deathbed, he can no longer speak. He's apparently dying of consumption. He can't speak. He can barely breathe. And I think his daughter-in-law, I think it's her, comes in and says, the baby that has been conceived in my womb isn't your son's, it is William Wallace's. And Longshanks begins to tremble and he tries to speak and you can tell he's getting all angry, but there's nothing he can do about it. In other words, then, a claimant to the Scottish throne is now going to have his descendant in my house. Going back to what Sue said, if these concubines were to have children, that would be his way of saying, see, now I've got my children in line. But essentially what is going on here, I think, is that was the first thing that they did in order to lay claim to the throne. I've slept with the king's wives, the king's concubines, and it's my way of asserting authority over the entire realm. So now Adonijah, who has been told, you're not going to be king, Solomon's going to be king, he's now in this left-handed way, he's coming back and he's saying, let me have Abishag. Well, who's Abishag? David did not sleep with Abishag in the sexual sense, but she was still someone that was near him that he could then say, look, I'm laying claim to the throne. He's the older brother. He's older than Solomon. So what he's trying to do is in a left-handed way, he's trying to get his foot in the door so that he can later lay claim to being king. I have Abishag, who is David's concubine, David's nurse. So Solomon sees this ruse that Adonijah is trying to pull off, and he goes out and kills him because he's clearly threatening for the throne. Was that the second bell? So anyway, that'll stop us right there. We'll just stop right there. Regarding, we were in the years of glory under Solomon. And next week we'll get into Solomon's wisdom and him building the temple and all those sorts of things. So we'll talk about those things next week and probably at least finish out Solomon's life and then get into the divided kingdom. Any questions or comments over anything?